sing, she's the passionate one. Oh, yeah, it's like lightning.
In the early 70s, the British band The Sweet was having a bit of an identity crisis. They were mostly known for playing pretty safe, anodyne bubblegum pop, like in their breakout hit, Funny Funny.
And it's so funny, funny what you do, honey, honey, what you do, what you mean to me.
And yes, that is the same band that would go on to record Ballroom Blitz only 2 years later. And that was the problem. The Sweet didn't write their own hits. They mostly worked with a songwriting duo of Mike Chapman and Nicky Chin, who thought the bubblegum sound would be the best way to capitalize on the band's impressive vocal harmonies. But this was the era of the birth of hard rock, with superstar bands like Led Zeppelin and The Who, and The Sweet wanted to do that. So while Chapman and Chin wrote the singles, the band started to write the B-sides to sneak in more of that hard rock sound. Those songs made their way into their live show, which earned them a reputation as wild, electric performers, and after reading those reviews, Chapman wanted to see what all the hype was about. He visited the band while they were touring Scotland, and after witnessing some particularly rowdy shows, he finally got it. The unhinged, unrestrained, bombastic energy of the performance showed him what the Sweet was really capable of if they could only shed the bubblegum sound, and he took that inspiration and turned it into one of rock music's most explosive classics, the Ballroom Blitz. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this, with Mick Tucker playing a slightly modified version of a train groove, a high-energy drum beat that's most common in country music. It's similar to a basic rock beat with a kick on 1 and 3 and snare on 2 and 4, but instead of a hi-hat, the constant space-filling part is more snares. They're just played lighter so the backbeat still stands out. The snare is a much noisier sound though, and it takes longer to fade, so the soundscape feels denser and busier. The snare is also culturally associated with drum rolls, so moving the whole pattern there makes it feel like it's constantly building steam toward an eventual release. Train grooves are usually pretty fast to get that rolling engine sound, and this is no exception. Tucker's playing around 220 beats per minute. It can be played straight or shuffled, and Tucker's shuffling pretty hard, which makes it feel bouncy and light. The only real change he made to the standard formula comes at the second bar, where he adds a little syncopation in the kick and one extra snare accent, creating an extra punch at regular intervals and breaking up the relatively monotonous groove into more digestible rhythmic chunks. Instead of chugging along forever like a traditional train groove, you get a little tension release pattern that marks out the 2-bar span and gives it a more recognizable large-scale structure. Subtle, but really important for the overall metric feel. Eventually, Brian Connolly comes in, addressing the rest of the band directly.
Are you ready, Steve? Uh-huh. Andy? Yeah. Mick? Okay.
And I love this. I'm a sucker for songs about live music that recreate elements of an actual live performance. This is most often done by just adding some crowd noise, but the Sweet takes it a step further and incorporates some of that showmanship they'd gotten so famous for. Obviously, from a practical perspective, this sort of check-in doesn't make much sense in a studio session where everyone's recording their parts separately. Even if they were playing together, Tucker's already in. He's been playing for 8 bars. Of course he's ready. And narratively, this conversation between bandmates specifically excludes the listener. It feels like something you're not supposed to hear, a pre-song conversation that should have been cut from the final track. But of course, that's the point, because symbolically, what it does is transform you from a listener to the audience. A dramatized check-in is a great way to start a live set. It introduces the whole band, lets each member take a bit of spotlight, draws things out to build anticipation and get the audience hyped, and also it doesn't hurt to actually check if everyone's good to go. It's a really fun idea that gets taken even further in the Surf Punks cover, where instead of just saying yes, the band members respond by noodling on their instruments.
Are you ready, Jerry?
That's some good stuff. Once he's confirmed that everyone's ready, Connolly announces the start of the song with his soaring scream,
All right, fellas, let's go!
Accompanied by a fill from Tucker that switches the train groove into straight hits on the snare, ramping up to Andy Scott's entrance with the song's signature riff. Or actually, before we get into that, one more thing about the drums. Under the riff, Tucker sticks on the same train groove, but now that the band is in, they've added a clap on the backbeat as well. Once again, this simulates a live environment. Getting the audience clapping is a staple of rock shows, because body percussion is the one instrument everyone brought with them. But back to the riff. Scott's playing a simple dotted cross rhythm starting on beat 2 and hitting every third eighth note after that. He keeps this going for 2 bars, matching the length of Tucker's metric cell, then cuts himself off to start the pattern again. It's a pretty simple way to add some rhythmic interest to an otherwise straightforward line, and it's made even more interesting by the shuffle feel. Not all eighth notes are the same length, so despite this dotted pattern being nominally even, it still has a little ebb and flow to it, depending on where in the bar each attack starts. Again, a pretty subtle thing, but it really highlights the bounciness already inherent to that shuffle rhythm, further capturing the raucous party atmosphere they're going for. Scott starts the riff on an E power chord, then holds the E steady while the B walks up to C sharp, D, then back down. This doesn't quite establish us in a complete scale, but it does tell us that whatever that scale is, it's got a major 6th and a minor 7th. Looking ahead, I think it's safe to call it Mixolydian, but whatever, we don't actually need to know that here. What matters is the impact of having these 2 notes, or more importantly, the impact of not having a minor 6th or major 7th. That's the thing that sets scales like Mixolydian and Dorian apart from traditional major and minor, and this riff is drawing our attention to that property. So let's talk about it. If you've taken enough music theory classes, you've probably heard the term leading tone before. This is basically another name for the major 7th of a key because it sits a half step below the root, and we tend to hear it as having a strong, almost gravitational pull upward. Like, if I play this, that D sharp feels really incomplete, which makes it super satisfying when I finally play the high E. D natural, on the other hand, is a whole step away, and that greater distance means it doesn't really have the same sense of directionality. What you may not know is that there's also a minor leading tone. After the root, the 5th is by far the most stable note in the key, and the flat 6 is a half step above that, so it has a similar, if slightly weaker, pull back down. These 2 leading tones help give their respective scales a sense of progression by emphasizing their strongest notes, so a scale with neither of them has less of a need for directional motion. This is why Mixolydian shows up in genres like rock and funk that are more about creating a musical atmosphere than a musical journey. And we can hear that in the riff. Every note is perfectly stable. You could stop anywhere and still be fine. To my ears, there is a sense of resolution on the final B, but I think that's less harmonic and more acoustic. Again, he's holding a low E throughout, turning this from a single-note harmony to a series of 2-note dyads. Those dyads are being run through some light distortion, and distortion does weird things to less consonant intervals. The return to B clears up the acoustic spectrum, and thus feels a bit more settled, even without the melody's help. Moving into the verse, the energy level drops significantly. This is most evident in Tucker's drums, where he switches the train groove for a more standard rock beat with quarter note taps on the hi-hat. But it doesn't stay there. We'll talk about all the individual parts in a minute, but the whole dynamic curve here is really interesting, so I want to start with that. The verse section alternates between restrained comping to support Connolly's vocals and bombastic returns to the main riff.
It's been getting so hard living with the things you do to me.
This pattern provides a bit of balance. The song's so high energy that it could easily get exhausting, especially since we're only going to keep ramping up from here. Having these moments that are slightly more tame gives it somewhere to build from, and the interspersed riffs make sure the energy of those first couple sections doesn't actually get lost. The quiet bits only last for like 5 seconds each before the distorted guitar and train groove come crashing back in to remind us what song we're actually listening to. We already talked about the riff though, so let's look at how they create that contrast in the quiet parts. Scott's playing this little blues shuffle thing on A, alternating between a power chord and this major 6th dyad figure of A and F sharp. This calls to mind the riff where he did a similar thing with E and C sharp, but these 2 notes also kind of imply a D major chord, so this resembles the sort of 1-4 vamp that should be very familiar to any student of the blues or its direct descendant, rock and roll. For his part, Scott says he was inspired here by Chuck Berry, and yeah, I can see that. It is interesting though that he's playing this 1-4 vamp on the 4 chord. We're in E after all, so if you want to wind down the energy, why play an A? And again, I think it helps to view this through the lens of the blues. At this point in rock history, the genre was starting to develop some of its own vocabulary, but it was still very much rooted in blues traditions. If we count in halftime and take a broad view of the chords, what we basically have in this verse is 2 bars of 4, then 2 bars of 1, which are the middle 4 bars of a 12-bar blues. I really doubt that's how they were thinking about it, but the point is that this particular harmonic shape is deeply rooted in this style of music. It carries a sense of controlled motion as the progression begins to open up. And while I don't want to take the 12-bar thing too literally, it's hard to miss that this repeated 4-1 figure also follows a long stretch of what is, more or less, just the 1 chord. This establishes the riff as a sort of home base that we always return to, the real heart of the Ballroom Blitz, while Connolly's lyrics are framed as passing thoughts and momentary distractions. But while the harmony contributes to that effect, most of the work is done by Connolly himself.
Oh, it's been getting so hard, living with the things you do to me.
The melody mostly sits on F sharp, which is interesting over an A chord, and there's probably something to be said there in theory, but I can't really bring myself to focus on it because he clearly doesn't want me to pay attention to him. His delivery here is so soft that he's practically mumbling, and even with the lower dynamic, he doesn't really stand out from the rest of the band.
Oh, it's been getting so hard, living with the things you do to me.
It's a fascinating choice, and it's one that doesn't make its way into most covers, which is a shame. It gives the verse a dreamy sort of atmosphere that stands in sharp contrast to the rest of the song. Ballroom Blitz is aggressive and chaotic, but Connolly is floating through that chaos, a passive observer of unrestrained mayhem, kinda like how Chapman must have felt at those Scotland shows. This frankly bizarre approach to vocal delivery adds a whole new dimension to the song, implying a much deeper and more interesting story than you get from the lyrics alone. Structurally, the verses are supposed to be where you get your narrative details, but by hiding the lyrics behind the orchestration, he's saying the story isn't about those details. The story is the atmosphere, and the atmosphere comes from the dynamics. But that approach can't last forever, which brings us to the pre-chorus.
Oh, I see a man at the back. As a matter of fact, his eyes are as red as the sun.
This part is actually sung by the bassist, Steve Priest. I'm not entirely sure why, since the second half is sung by Connolly.
Oh, yeah, it's like lightning.
And he sounds pretty much the same, but I do have a couple guesses. First, while their voices are similar, Priest's delivery is a bit more theatrical, with less gravel and a wider range. I'm hesitant to try to notate this precisely because it sounds less like singing and more like a dramatic recitation, but either way, he's covering almost 2 octaves here, wider than even the most excited natural speech. This takes the introduction of our new characters, the man in the back and the girl in the corner, and gives it a sort of mythic flair. They feel larger than life, with glowing eyes that could kill you with a wink. Connolly, on the other hand, sounds more traditionally rock, with some extra rasp and a more consistent melodic contour, which is a better fit for the more straightforward pandemonium of his part. That, I think, is probably the main reason for this choice, but again, I can't help but think of this song in terms of live staging. It's just cool to have someone else take the mic for a second, and if you watch videos of live performances, Priest stepping up and singing his lines is always a big moment. Seriously, look up their performance on Top of the Pops. It's great. Plus, on the practical side of things, using 2 different voices makes the handoff smoother. Connolly can come in as Priest wraps up without needing to catch his breath first. That's not a problem on a studio track where you can just overdub a second take, but setting it up this way in the first place lets it transition seamlessly into their live sets. And these parts also have very different accompaniments. Under Priest, most of the band drops out except for Tucker playing the train groove, giving him a lot of space while still keeping the energy level high. It's exciting, but there's also nothing to distract you from Priest introducing his characters. Connolly, on the other hand, is supported by a big walk up the scale in thirds,
Lightning! Everybody was frightening, and the music was soothing.
although I think this progression will make more sense after we look at the chorus, so let's put a pin in that for now. First, I want to talk about the choice to basically just have 2 full pre-choruses, which begs the question, what's a pre-chorus for? The obvious answer is that it's a transition point that builds anticipation for the chorus. In principle then, doing 2 in a row should build even more excitement. The first one seems to be promising a conclusion, but right where you'd expect that climax, you instead find yourself being dragged even higher. It's a good idea in theory, but it's hard to pull off. If your second pre-chorus doesn't resolve the tension of the first, it feels disjointed, but if it does resolve it, it's resolved. You've got to somehow keep the momentum going smoothly over the bar line, and Ballroom Blitz has a really elegant solution. Just use 2 different kinds of tension. The first pre-chorus, the one with Priest vocals, relies on orchestral tension. Suddenly removing most of the band might seem like it'd kill the energy, but in practice we've heard these sorts of drops often enough to know that they're about to come back in even louder. That's standard rock stuff, and they even double down on it by dropping Tucker's groove as well when Priest sings his most iconic line.
And the girl in the corner, let no one ignore her, 'cause she thinks she's the passion passionate one.
Connolly's pre-chorus, on the other hand, brings the whole band back in and relies mainly on melodic tension. The notes just keep rising, creating a sense of growing anxiety. There's also some rhythmic tension, with Connolly using shorter, more fragmented vocal phrases, and a bit of harmonic tension, with some particularly dissonant chord choices, but again, we pinned that. Point is, Connolly's section is able to cleanly resolve the tension of the first half while diverting it into a new kind of tension that keeps the build going. But okay, chorus. I said we need to look at the chords, so let's start there. It starts on F sharp, the 2 chord, then we get a simple 4-5-1 to take us back to E. Holding off on the 1 chord until the end of the phrase gives the chorus a sense of direction and closure, resolving each statement before the next one begins. That's especially true thanks to its straightforward use of classic harmonic functions. The 5-1 especially is a sound deeply rooted in the Western music tradition, and it makes the arrival of the E chord feel both satisfying and complete. Which is why I wanted to look at this first, returning to the pre-chorus for a second. We see that it's almost the same progression. Almost, but not quite. Where the chorus has a B chord, the pre-chorus uses C. And that's weird. First, even without hearing the chorus, the 2-4 is clearly setting up a 5 chord. Or at the very least, it's setting up some sort of strong motion, but the C breaks that. It's a third away from both the A chord before it and the E chord after, turning the progression from a clean directional march to a series of unconnected harmonic islands. It's also not in the key. The riff clearly established us in E mixolydian, which should have C sharp. And even if it hadn't, we just heard an F sharp power chord. C natural is a tritone away, so if we look at the root motion, Priest is kind of arpeggiating a diminished triad here. Spooky. And that's not even getting into that whole minor leading tone thing where the flat 6 is supposed to pull strongly back down to 5, not jump away to the root. Point is, for a lot of reasons, the pre-chorus progression starts off pretty normal, using standard rock harmonic vocabulary, but on the third line, when Connolly sings the word soothing, it all seems to go off the rails.
Lightning! Everybody was frightening! And the music was soothing!
Symbolism. The other highlight of the chorus is, of course, the vocals.
In the man at the back said everyone attack and it turned into a ballroom blitz!
You may have heard me talk in previous videos about the importance of blending voices, and this is what I'm talking about. The 4 bandmates become one singer, layered perfectly into a towering stack of harmonies. No wonder Chapman and Chin wanted them doing bubblegum pop. And when I say towering, I mean it. Whoever's on the top line goes all the way up to B5. For reference, the legendary high note in Aerosmith's Dream On is A flat 5, and this is the B above it. That's absurdly high. I'm not sure I have much to say about this as a theorist, but as a vocalist, damn. Anyway, these blended harmonies are more than just a showcase for the band's talents. They're also a new kind of energy, marking the story's transition from a single perspective to a collective experience. After all, you can't have a Ballroom Blitz with just one person. While the guitar and bass play this whole progression as an ascending line, just like in the pre-chorus, the vocal part adds an extra flourish, dropping down, then scooping back up to an E chord at the end.
Turn into a ballroom blitz!
I'm sure this is partly a relief for that top-line singer, but it also gives a greater melodic emphasis to that final E, again increasing the sense of closure at the end of the phrase. It turned into a Ballroom Blitz is a pretty definitive statement, and the music is working hard to support it. That's taken even further at the end of the chorus, where they do this repeated chromatic walk,
Ballroom blitz! Ballroom blitz!
again moving from D major to E major, but this time with a D sharp in between to connect them and really stick the landing. And that's even further emphasized by the rhythm. It's kinda like a tresillo, dividing the eighth notes in the bar into groups of 3, 3, and 2. This accelerating pattern is already really good at driving strong rhythmic resolutions, but they make it even stronger by skipping the first attack.
Ballroom blitz!
You still get the accelerating effect, but it starts off syncopated, so it's even more off balance, and the more tension you build, the more satisfaction you get from the release. Both the out-of-key D-sharp chord and the incomplete tresillo make the arrival of a simple E on a clear metric downbeat feel really good, so we know the Ballroom Blitz has arrived. After the chorus, we get another dose of orchestral tension, with everyone dropping out while Scott returns to the riff. And then, as the band returns, they bring in a second overdubbed guitar with a much more heavily distorted sound. That new guitar carries through into the verse, where it provides even more dynamic contrast with the quiet sections to raise the stakes as the song progresses. This is kinda Orchestration 101, bringing in new layers on repeated sections to keep the overall dynamic contour moving upward, but I wanted to draw your attention to it because I think it's done really well here. The choice to leave the quiet sections exactly the same really highlights how much louder the new guitar is, in a way that makes this verse feel so much more exciting than a simple repeat. Compare this to this. That leads into another pre-chorus where the lyrics get even wilder.
And the band started leaving, 'cause they all stopped breathing.
And then another chorus, but here, after just one of those D-sharp E walk-ups, they suddenly veer off into this extended breakdown section. It starts with Priest, accompanied only by claps,
Ballroom Blitz.
and then each repeat introduces something new. First, we get these enormous stabs at the end of the phrase from Scott. Then Tucker joins in with a sort of jungle beat on the toms. This is an interesting combination of its earlier patterns. Like the train groove, he's playing constant eighths on a single drum, but this time, instead of a backbeat, the accents match with that syncopated kick. Next, there's some noodling from Scott on a cleaner guitar. Another guitar layer with a sharper, more aggressive pattern. Bringing back that cross-rhythm idea with groups of 3 against a 4/4 beat, and finally, Connolly comes in to transition back to the pre-chorus. These 20 seconds are almost like the song in microcosm, building from a simple initial idea into this massive pile of sounds all fighting with each other for attention. And all that chaos is anchored by the chord stabs. They're loud enough to always cut through, and they're in these syncopated positions near the ends of bars that give the whole build-up a really jagged quality, like it's trying to tear itself apart. And again, you can almost hear the staging as Scott thrashes away in this dramatic start-stop pattern. But there's one more layer here, hidden away where you might never think to look. The breakdown leads back to the pre-chorus, then the chorus, and finally to what seems like a new section with the band chanting the name of the song.
It's Ballroom Blitz.
But underneath it's some of the layers from the breakdown. They leave out the last couple guitar parts, but it's the same bass, the same drums, and most importantly, the same chord stabs. The song tried to control the chaos of the breakdown by returning to some more organized sections, but it just carried right on through the other side. It's kind of poetic if you think about it. And that's pretty much it. From there, they return to the riff, and Scott takes a solo until the song fades out. I sometimes feel like I read too much into fade-outs, but I really like having one here. The hectic debauchery of a ballroom blitz shouldn't just end at a specified time. It goes until no one's left to keep it going. Fading out without a definite ending gives the impression that the band keeps playing forever, or at least until they're too tired to go on, and for this particular story, that's the only way it could possibly end. And hey, thanks for watching, and thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewitt, Damian Fuller-Sutherland, Neil Moore, Jeff, and Michael Mole. Check out the Nebula cut for a fuller outro, and as always, keep on rockin'.